When it comes to audio gear, the word broadcast is thrown around a lot. But outside of the marketing speak by companies trying to convince you to buy their latest shiny new toy, what does it actually mean? And is it something that makes a massive difference between broadcast and prosumer? The differences might not be exactly what you think. So let's break it down. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're comparing. On the prosumer side, we have Rode with the Rodecaster Pro 2. Arguably one of the most influential companies right now on this side of broadcast, leading the charge as new media takes over from legacy media. It's well built, extremely versatile multi-tool that tries to answer every need that arises in whatever you deploy it to do. Very much an impressive piece of gear, this Rodecaster Pro 2. Literally a station in a box. But before we check out the broadcast gear, there's something you do need to know about this video. This isn't going to be an apples to apples comparison because we're not really comparing gear. What we're doing is we're outlining the differences between the type of gear that is sold for each purpose. And this is important to remember, and we're going to go over the why in just a bit. Now then, onto this side, you have the Angry Audio Chameleon Smooth Mic Processor, one of the only units that I know of that is specially designed for use with a particular microphone or microphones. This is meant to work with the Shure SM7B or really any microphone from the SM series. By the way, yes, I do have a full review of this coming. Get subscribed. You're not going to want to miss that because when you break down what this thing can actually do, it's rather impressive. This thing is feature-packed. Don't worry, we're going to get into that. But there's something else we need to discuss right now because you may have noticed the first real difference. Now, here we come back to the apples to apples conversation. You see, broadcast gear tends to be more targeted to a specific process, like processing. So if you were to look at a broadcast studio, you would find everything separate, from the preamps all the way down to the monitoring. In fact, you know those big boards you see in radio stations? Did you know that those things are just glorified controllers? There's nothing really inside those boards. They're kind of like an over-glorified mouse. There's no such thing as a studio in a box in broadcasting. And that's for a very specific reason. If something breaks or goes wrong in a broadcast situation, having a piecemeal setup allows you to keep most things going while you replace the broken part. On the other side of that coin, if anything goes in an all-in-one solution, well, the whole thing needs to be unplugged, which in broadcasting terms, that's really, really bad. In the world of broadcasting, downtime is death, which isn't as dramatic for a podcast, even the biggest of podcasts. But it also serves another purpose. It makes the build of the studio more personalized. Don't like one of the pieces of the setup? It's easy to replace. Okay, now let's take a look at what the Rodecaster Pro 2 brings to the table. And the first thing is space. Full-on studios take up a lot of room, which isn't going to work at your kitchen table or as a corner in your bedroom. Now, that sounds like I'm pandering, but you do notice that I didn't say anything about sound quality when talking about the broadcast stuff. And that's because you can get some pretty fantastic sounding audio out of this gear. So little things like space is important. But also cost effectiveness is a big win for the Rodecaster Pro 2. And we're going to get into the pricing models for broadcast gear in a bit, but no matter how you shake it, this is going to be cheaper. And that is the primary reason you haven't seen much crossover from the professional broadcast world into the podcast world. Which, by the way, is starting to become a conversation. I spoke with several companies that were curious about what was happening on this side. You know, it's kind of like sailors on a sinking ship, wondering what it's like to be on a boat with no holes in it. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that look at this Rodecaster Pro 2 and think it's overpriced. I've seen you in the comments. But what if I told you that from a price to performance metric, this thing blows full professional studios out of the water? Remember, before you scoff, we're talking price to performance. These all-in-one interfaces are powerful little machines, offering the ability to broadcast, record with onboard processing, I might add, and a whole slew of little tricks up its sleeve to make you not need anything else. That's pretty impressive for 700 bucks, considering all that in a broadcast setup would be thousands upon thousands. Again, I need to point out, just this board with nothing inside of it, that glorified mouse, costs over $8,000. Now, it does say that there's a bunch of things like EQ and dynamics on every channel, but that's because you need to buy the $5,000 Blade processor to go with it for it to even work. Even this Angry Audio, a single channel preamp with processing, is almost $1,000 US. And it doesn't even interface with your computer, meaning you need to plug this into something that does interface. The idea of spending under $1,000 for an all-in-one solution like this is starting to sound a bit more approachable and reasonable, isn't it? But why is there such a disparity in cost? Is broadcast gear just so much better? Okay, so before I start spouting off here and making enemies of all my broadcast brethren, yes, gear that is specifically produced for broadcast is generally better built and has more utility. Not to mention, as stuff is all built separately, it is generally all built to higher standards and nothing is held back due to concerns of cost. But it isn't worth a price that is thousands or sometimes tens of thousands of dollars more expensive. Then why is it? Well, this answer goes for both build quality as well as cost. You see, this Rodecaster Pro 2 has way more marketability than the Angry Audio Smooth. There's way more podcasters out there than there are radio stations, right? Broadcast gear tends to be built in small batches and sold off in much smaller numbers, meaning there needs to be much higher margins for the companies building it. But that also means there is more thought put into building usability, as they have to make up for that difference in pricing somehow, as well as it needing to be built like a tank. Whereas companies like Rode are expecting way more of an audience, so they can keep their prices lower and make less of a margin, which also includes finding ways to keep the costs down as low as possible. It's like the difference between selling one for $100,000 versus selling $100,000 for $1. They both make the same amount of money in that example, but with way different sales strategies. But if you're looking for one big positive into buying broadcast gear, everything I just said has one massive impact on the final product. And this is where broadcast gear really gets its bragging rights. You see, this is a Symmetrix 528E. This is a channel strip for processing that includes all the fun things like EQ, compression, and a de-esser. Back in the 2000s, this was the best and brightest in broadcast, and these were in every radio station. In fact, this very one spent every day over 20 years on and working in a rack room. This thing was only turned off when the engineers decided to remove it and upgrade it. 20 bloody years! And that's where this stuff really starts to shine. I mentioned it earlier, but it bears repeating. In broadcast, one thing that is a universal truth: downtime is death. Just 30 seconds of dead air can cost thousands in a small station and millions of dollars in a large market station. And while most companies have an engineer on 24-hour pagers, companies tend to make decisions on stuff that they don't have to worry about. Like back in 2005 when all the companies bought into that Symmetrix 528E. Mission critical is on the top of their list for needs. The differences between broadcast and prosumer are incredibly vast here. Prosumer gear actually works on an upgrade cycle. Now, you don't have to upgrade, but if you want the new shiny, you're going to buy the new shiny, aren't you? And that follows the trend for basically all tech that we are sold these days. Have you seen anyone with a 10-year-old phone? Probably not. How about a 15-year-old laptop? Nope. But again, when these cost a fraction of what this costs, you can kind of see why. Most people are happy to pay money every couple of years than to remortgage their house every 10 or 15. So which is better, Aiden? Well, I can't lie, the broadcast gear is better, and that just comes back to the build and the longevity. These things are tailored to a use case and are meant to work in mission-critical situations. This isn't taking anything away from the prosumer gear like this Rodecaster Pro 2 here, because these things are unbelievable deals considering how much they can do. And honestly, cost isn't the only thing stopping broadcast gear from taking over the podcast space. And that's for a few reasons. First, broadcast gear tends to be a bit more difficult to understand for the uninitiated. There's a reason stations have actual engineers on staff. Second, once this gear is mass produced and rolled out for everyone, well, there's going to be corners that need to be cut. For example, the guy that creates the presets for the audio gear for Angry Audio is called an audio processing architect, which is something you don't see in these other companies that create podcast gear. Perhaps there's some in between that needs to be met before these two worlds begin to collide. But there's a word of caution for any of those podcast companies that might be watching. A lot of these companies like Wheatstone and Angry Audio were recognizing the rest of the audio industry that seems to be thriving. One of the biggest questions I got from several of these companies at NAB was, how do we get into podcasting? And while you think this is just them trying to steal the beginner podcasters, not really. There's a massive growing industry of podcasters that are making a shameless amount of money and may need more mission-critical gear. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these companies looking to get some experts from the podcast end of the industry to lead them into competing for your dollars as well. Now, if you want to see this thing featured a bit more, the Angry Audio Smooth Mic Processor, the Chameleon Smooth Mic Processor, stay tuned and get subscribed, because when you start to break down what this thing can actually do, it's rather impressive. Anyways, what do you think? Let me know down below. Cheers, guys. And thanks for watching.